Wolka is going to talk to us about Confederate printers, the good, bad, and the ugly.
So far today we've talked about chemical formulas and serial number runs and things like that. Well, we're doing a change in pace now. We're going to talk about greed, fear, backstabbing, and skullduggery, as personified by the 11 firms that printed currency at one time or another for the Confederate States of America. And I will tell you up front that there is all sorts of information we don't know yet, that we haven't dug up. But this would make, if anybody's looking for a book project, this would make a fabulous book project for somebody to do. Who knows, maybe I'll do it. So as Peter said, we're going to talk about the good, the bad, the ugly. There was a shortage of the good, a significant oversupply of the bad, and an equally bad supply of the ugly. So we're going to talk about the cast of characters. We started out with the well-known names: American Banknote Company and National Banknote Company, and a little outfit called the Southern Banknote Company. And these are the firms that everybody used if you were having your notes printed in antebellum America at the outset of the Civil War. As we progress through the Civil War, though, we start adding names that are less household names. Firms like Hoyer and Ludwig, Jules Maneuvrier, Blanton Duncan, J.T. Patterson, Leggett Keating and Ball, and Keating and Ball, Evans and Cogswell, and last but not least, Archer and Daly, or Archer and Halpin. So at one time or another, in the short space of about 4 years, all of these people were involved in printing banknotes for the Confederate States of America, as well as for a number of commercial banks and private issuers. But all 11 of these folks were trying to keep up with the demand for Confederate currency, and most times not doing a very good job of keeping up. So let's start this in roughly chronological order. If we look at the month before the war started, March of 1861, we already have movement in Montgomery, which was the provisional capital of the Confederacy, to start lining up suppliers for currency. And the first ones to step to the plate were the American Banknote Company and National Banknote Company in New York City. Now, some of you may say, well, no, wait, you must be mistaken about American Banknote Company, because we all know that National Banknote Company printed the first notes for the Confederacy, the so-called Montgomery notes. And in fact, they did, but it was a sublet order. American Banknote Company is the one that got paid for the printing, and American Banknote Company is the one that sublet the business to National Banknote Company. The order was negotiated through my favorite named person in the entire world, Gazaway Bug Lamar. Gazaway's mother hated him. Can you imagine going through school with a first name like Gazaway? It is no coincidence that he went by G.B. Lamar. He negotiated a contract not with National Banknote Company, but with American Banknote Company for bonds, certificates of stock, and treasury notes. And this was in early March of 1861. You may say, well, wasn't that kind of like treason, trading with the enemy? Well, from American and National Banknotes' perspective, there was still, quote unquote, this plausible chance that this would be settled amicably, and this was just another customer. This is called rationalization. There were, as most of us who are familiar with Confederate notes know, there were two shipments. There was a shipment of 607 four-subject sheets, 1,000, a 500, 150, and a second shipment that was shipped after the war started. It was shipped sometime between April 22nd and April 24th. They shipped 1,000 sheets of hundreds and fifties. And of course, this is what the notes look like. This happens to be the 500. The thing to take away from this is every one of these were pre-war vignettes. They were vignettes that were on hand, ready to go, roll them across the steel intaglio plate, and print the things. There was not time to do new vignette work because this was a fast line project. So this is the 500. You can find every one of these vignettes on obsolete notes that were issued before the war. This turned into be a one and done type of business though, because on April 25th, 1861, federal authorities raided both the plants of the American Banknote Company and the National Banknote Company, confiscated the plates and everything else that was still in process when they entered the premises on April 25th. The story, which may be apocryphal, maybe not, is that the last shipment of 1,000 sheets made it out of New York City's harbor about 30 minutes ahead of the federal authorities. So this obviously brings up the question in Memiger's mind, the Secretary of the Treasury for the Confederacy, what now? Well, he turns to the Southern Banknote Company of New Orleans. Now, there is some evidence that suggests this was not as haphazard as might be initially suggested. There is some suggestion by none other than Dr. Ball, who was the preeminent authority on Confederate notes a number of years, decades back, that in fact American Banknote Company had made agreement to supply the Confederacy with a printing plant, in effect creating the Confederate Bureau of Engraving and Printing. Now, for a number of reasons, it didn't happen, but part of the plan was to use Southern Banknote Company. Who was Southern Banknote Company? Somebody knows.
It's an office of the National Banknote Company in New Orleans.
It was the office of the American Banknote Company in New
it's
Orleans.
American. Oh, I see. It's not,
Very teeny tiny small office, not really capable of supplying anything remotely resembling high volume production. But the plan was to use this little office in New Orleans as kind of a bridge supply until they could get the equipment and so forth that American Banknote Company had verbally promised the Confederacy set up in Richmond. So this isn't as haphazard as it sometimes sounds. There's a fairly well thought out thought process to this. However, this is where the backstabbing comes in. Keating and Ball, and we'll talk about Keating and Ball a little bit later, but Keating and Ball was a competitor, if you would, a potential supplier of Confederate notes, and they got into a whispering contest that perhaps the manager of Southern Banknote Company in New Orleans was not exactly the true supporter of the Southern cause that he would like people to believe. And there's a lot of correspondence that goes back and forth accusing Schmidt, who was the guy's name at Southern Banknote Company, of being not fully on board with the Confederate cause and that type of thing. The actual truth was Keating and Ball wanted all the plates, the presses, things like that were there to be had.
well, was the Southern Banknote Company I thought it was a dependency of the New York Print, the American.
It was.
Banknote.
It's now cut off. So Schmidt is acting as his independent local manager. And this became a push and tug. Meminger sent Ball down to New Orleans to try to get the presses, and one of the local bank presidents said, no, don't get excited. He's going to get these notes done. And finally sent back an example, and Meminger finally backed off a little bit and said, okay, well, if they're that good, maybe we'll just let this alone. So at any rate, Southern Banknote Company was, as we say, slow but good. They turned out quality designs. These are the so-called first Richmonds, but Southern Banknote Company was so slow that they actually were more like the second Richmonds. But these were intended to be the first issues done by Southern Banknote Company. Does anybody know the connection between these and the Montgomery notes? If you look, you don't count Pierre, we're sorry. You can't tell. If you look at the printing figures, you see that they issued 1,606 50s and 100s of the Montgomery notes. They printed 1,607. Where did the last sheet go of 2 notes, of 50 and 100? They were sent by messenger to New Orleans, given to Schmidt, says, make us notes just like the Montgomery's 50s and 100s. What they didn't take into account is that Schmidt didn't have access to any of the National Banknote Company vignettes. So he had to use American Banknote Company vignettes. And so that's how these notes, the intention was to do copies of the Montgomery 100s and 50s, but this is what they got. And these took forever. There are some sources that suggest one of the reasons they took forever is that this was low profit business and Southern Banknote Company had higher profit business printing notes for some of the New Orleans commercial banks. So there's still a lot of legwork to do to understand how much of that is true and how much of that is just mudslinging. They did continue on and they engraved a number of notes. 5, they did a whole series, a 5, a 10, a 20, and a 50, and they in fact produced plates for this and printed tens of thousands of these things. But then we had this little unpleasantness at the beginning of May 1st or right at the end of April called the Fall of New Orleans, and that took care of Southern Banknote Company as being a supplier for the Confederacy. Now, one interesting note that I ran across that I had not known before is that the plates for these notes allegedly still exist in the Smithsonian Institution. So someplace these plates are still around because Schmidt turned them over to federal authorities after the Union took over New Orleans.
Wendell,
Sir?
the plates for the T5 and 6 do exist,
Right.
but I've never heard that these exist, but maybe they do. Nobody's ever seen that though.
Yeah.
5 and 6, there's pictures of the 5s and 6.
The source for that information is from an article that Doug Ball wrote in the 70s.
Okay.
So,
All right.
again, this is not unusual to have information that doesn't exactly agree with each other or is inconclusive or is incomplete, which is one of the interesting reasons people collect these things. Then we have the Jules Manouvrier story. Jules was a little teeny tiny New Orleans shop that kind of got identified when they were going through all this tumult and shouting trying to get Southern Banknote Company up to speed. And so there was a period in 1861, early 1862, where the test for being an approved Confederate printing vendor was if you could fog the mirror. And if you could fog the mirror, chances are you could get a contract with the Confederacy to print notes. And Jules, in fact, because he was printing a number of notes for other Southern customers, ended up with a contract to print 5s and 10s. Jules, unfortunately, got an F in product packaging. And his first shipment of 5 and 10s was essentially came apart at the seams in Petersburg, Virginia, and some of the local folks decided to put a few of them in circulation. So this created all sorts of consternation with the Department of the Treasury, and in fact, they never issued the 10. Now, one of the crown jewels of Confederate collecting would be if someone ever found one of the 10s that was put in circulation. Because according to the period documentation, they put some 10s in circulation. Whether they got them all back or not, don't know. But at any rate, they continued on with the 5s. So they canned Jules almost before he ever got a chance to say hello. And they shipped some of his equipment and one employee to Hoyer and Ludwig. Now this is the note. Tell me 2 things. We talked about unique things on small sites. What are the 2 unique things on this note for that period of time? That's one. There's no vignettes. Every other Confederate note has at least a minimum of one vignette on it. This one has no vignettes, it's all text. And in fact, a very pale blue back. So this again is one of the keys to the series. It's not prohibitively rare, but it's very, very scarce. And so Jules was out of business, and then when, of course, the city fell in 1862, that, of course, put an end to that. We now come to Hoyer and Ludwig. Hoyer and Ludwig is maybe my favorite of all these guys. Hoyer and Ludwig was composed of a guy by the name of Louis Hoyer, who was a financial and silent partner, and Charles Ludwig, who was a printer, and his most recent stint was with the state printer of Virginia, Ritchie and Donovan, from 1857 to 1860. So you're right in Richmond, why not? You can print just as well as some of these other folks. The firm had been established just before the start of the war in Richmond, and Memminger awarded the contract to the company in 1861 after realizing he was getting no place fast with the erstwhile Southern Banknote Company in New Orleans. The notes that were printed by Hoyer and Ludwig do not win any beauty contests. These are, shall we say, rustic designs. So this is the 5. And again, most of these vignettes you can find on pre-war banknotes. 10. You notice the only thing they changed between the 5 and the 10 in the center vignette is they took away the 5 numeral and inserted the first Confederate national flag. The 20, the 50, and the 100. So they weren't pretty. All the banks went absolutely bonkers. They said, my God, they'll counterfeit these things like mad. And in fact, they did. But they now had at least 670,000 notes in circulation, which was 670,000 more than they had before they got Hoyer and Ludwig started. This, however, gets turned on its head with the Peninsula Campaign of 1862. The Peninsula Campaign was a Union effort to capture Richmond. And it was fought between May and July of 1862. And the Union was ultimately repulsed in July of 1862 at the so-called series of battles called the 7 Days Battles, literally at the gates of Richmond. However, in May of 1862, panic between Jefferson Davis and Memminger said, we've got to get the printers out of town. And so all the printers who were presently doing business were ordered to leave town. Blanton Duncan and Keating and Ball do, but Hoyer and Ludwig refused to do so. They have now found out that actions have consequences. Memminger felt that he couldn't reward public insubordination, so what to do? He canceled all their printing contracts and gave them to a personal friend of CSA Vice President Alexander Stevens, a guy by the name of J.T. Patterson. But here, this is a very clever business move. These people were astute business people. Hoyer and Ludwig strikes back, says, okay, tell you what, we don't have any business. But we're going to give you, Mr. Memminger, a proposal you can't refuse. So on August 16th, they give him a proposal that drops the printing price from $12 to $10 per 1,000 sheets, charges $250 per new plate and engraving, and no charge for transfer plates. In other words, when you have to do a new stone, versus $250 for every 24,000 notes, which was about every 3,000 sheets. And no transportation charges. Hoyer and Ludwig's calculation said this dropped the government's cost to $240 per 3,000 sheets from $538 per 3,000 sheets, or a reduction of almost over half. Memminger, being no fool, turns the knife. He accepts the business proposal from Hoyer and Ludwig, which, by the way, has no business. If you have no business, you can drop the price all the way down to zero if you want to, because it's not going to cost you anything. And on August 21st, he promptly imposes the same terms on all the competitors who do have the business, costing them thousands. But no devious deed goes unrewarded. On August 26, 1862, Memminger very quietly awards Hoyer and Ludwig a contract to print a new design 10. And this is the note that they were allowed to print. This is called Type 46, if you collect Confederate notes. And they had some problems. They put the wrong date on it. You had 6 months instead of 6 months. They had some issues, but they nonetheless printed this. But there were some interesting restrictions. Memminger continued to use Hoyer and Ludwig sparingly to print notes until early 1864, with the express understanding they couldn't put their name on any of the notes. And the firm ended up printing 635,000 of these 10s, and they also printed 1s and 2s from type 1863 and 1864 types. So they were kind of the peak shaving company that the department used when they needed more notes, and they really didn't want to make a big issue out of Hoyer and Ludwig doing them. Hoyer and Ludwig, of course, had the last laugh. If you get a magnifier and you look just under the bail on any type 46 $10 note in the central vignette, you will come upon the tiny letters Ludwig. They're there, and they're so well hidden, you really need a glass and a little practice where they're at to see it. So he got his name in there, and this is not without precedent. All sorts of other places where banknote engravers have added their names quietly to their work. Now we come to the incarnate bad boy of Confederate printers, a guy by the name of Blanton Duncan, the scallywag of Confederate printers. He's a former Kentucky military unit commander. He had a regiment that actually fought in the First Battle of Bull Run. And he was also a delegate to the Russellville Convention, at which Kentucky secessionists voted to leave the Union. Now, Kentucky and Missouri are the two states who had simultaneous membership in both the Confederate States of America and the United States of America. In theory, they had two separate congressional delegations. So he's a part of this, but he finally decides that he's going to ingratiate himself with Memminger. His specialty to begin with was securing currency paper with mixed results. Some of the paper he bought they couldn't use. But that's how he got associated with Memminger. And of course, he secured a printing contract in early 1862. Now, you can say a lot of things about Blanton, but you can be sure that he was never very far from controversy. He once masqueraded as a military unit and commandeered the employees and printing ink from a competitor under the need of military necessity. And he was not above just outright lies. He was also a nasty person to work for, always having labor problems and that type of thing. Duncan was a firm believer in begging for forgiveness rather than asking for permission. And he had possessed an excellent selective memory. And we'll give you a couple examples of how those worked, the second two bullets here in a second. One thing you can say about Duncan is he was not particularly a gifted banknote designer. He did a number of different notes, and in fact, an interesting way to collect Confederate notes is just collect notes that Duncan printed. It's relatively inexpensive. There's only one type that's a little pricey, but all the others are readily available. It makes an interesting collection. So these are notes where the counterfeiters had just about as much skill as he did. And it was hard to tell some of these apart. Some of them you could tell apart because they were better than the originals. So this is a 20, printed a 10, another 10. I don't know, Meminger looks like the Elephant Man or something there down in the corner on that one. Printed 5s. And he printed a whole series of 2s and 1s. This is the one with the oopsie-doo date. Although to be fair, he wasn't the only guy that got the dates wrong on some of these notes just based on when they were authorized. This is the 2. This is the 2 with the green print. We'll talk about this in a second. Then he did a series of 1s. I like the 1 because the vignette on the left has the arms of Uruguay. What Uruguay has to do with the Confederate States of America, I have no earthly idea, other than it was probably an available stock cut that looked good. So just for an example of the lowlights of Duncan's personality, let's look at type 42 and 43. The common one of the two is the top note, and the bottom one was an example of Blanton's ability to ask for forgiveness rather than seek permission. He decided it would be a good idea to put that 2 green protector on the notes. Only thing is he didn't ask if that was okay with the people who were paying the bills. And they said, no, that's not okay. And so he immediately stopped and he printed, the majority of the notes are like the top note. They printed over 1.7 million of these things. This specific pair of 2 designs, with the vast majority being the top. And correspondence with Meminger dated May 26, 1862 clearly shows that Duncan was responsible for the design, because in this letter Duncan takes credit and says, the vignette represents the South rising in its might and striking down the North and crippling the eagle. Those are his words. 1875, he does an interview with the Louisville Commercial newspaper and categorically denied that there was ever such a design produced, which is a little difficult to fathom given that there are 1.7 million pieces of evidence that it did. And number 2, he had no knowledge of the existence of that design. He did not know.
He was an opportunist.
Oh no, I have a better name for him than that. After the war, Blanton finally kind of migrated to the left coast, and he didn't accept the terms of his printing contract in 1863, so they pulled his contract. And then he moved to the West Coast, where the Los Angeles Times labeled him as an erratic bloviator.
Yeah.
Which means a big blowhard that has no idea what he's talking about and can talk forever without having any meaning to it. A politician. Controversy even followed him into death, as he wrote his only daughter out of his will, and she had the will invalidated by having him declared insane. She was probably right. Now we go to Leggett, Keating, and Ball. This is an interesting, there's a story to be told here well above and beyond this. But Leggett, Keating, and Ball was composed of William Leggett, who was a lettering specialist, a former American Banknote Company employee in New York; Edward Keating, who was a portrait engraver, British subject, and a former American Banknote Company employee, and in fact of some of its predecessor companies. So these were the 2 guys who knew how to do engraving, and the 2 key parts being portraits and vignettes and lettering. And Meminger hired a guy by the name of Thomas Ball with the express charge of setting up a Confederate States of America Bureau of Engraving and Printing. He wanted control of the printing. He didn't want this grab bag of crazy people holding him hostage. And as the story goes, Ball went north, had an agreement with American Banknote Company that they would supply the wherewithal to set up a printing facility in the South. And they all came back south in August of 1861, a couple months after the war started. And my thought is that they were probably charged, or they thought at least that they were charged with setting up a national printing and engraving establishment. So it was in business as Leggett, Keating, and Ball from August of 1861, these are all approximate dates, to March of 1862. Why the short life? It seems that Memminger believed that Leggett was a confidant of a Union spy and gave an ultimatum to the firm to get Leggett out of the business or he'd take all their contracts away. The letter itself is an interesting read. It's not very subtle. They gave him, I think, 2 weeks to get rid of Leggett or they could go do something else. Predictably, the firm forced out Leggett and operated under the banner of Keating and Ball from the spring of 1862 until Columbia, South Carolina fell in February of 1865. Keating and Ball became the primary Confederate printer by 1863 after they got rid of some of the early players like Duncan and Patterson, whose contracts were terminated about that time. And the firm engraved the master plates and also did both lithographic and intaglio printing. So they were kind of a one-stop shop. And we'll talk about the subtlety of engraving the master plates here in a second. And we talked about this. Certainly by December 1862, they standardized designs, and for the remainder of the war, pretty much the designs didn't change very much. They made some minor adjustments, but they all pretty much looked the same, and they standardized. They had way too many designs floating around in the early part of the war, and this was something that had to be done. But by December of 1862, all the other printers, Duncan, who was still in business, Hoyer and Ludwig, who was printing odds and ends, and a new company, Evans and Cogswell, were doing nothing more than printing notes from Keating and Ball engraved masters. So they were the job shop printers. Keating and Ball was running the show in terms of what the notes looked like, producing the master plates and that type of thing. So the fine print tells the tale here. This is a common February 1864 one, but what you want to pick up, you can see at the bottom, it says engraved by Keating and Ball, Columbia, South Carolina. Now, it's lithographed, so why would it say engraved? Well, because they did a master plate that they used then to make lithographic stones from. So they engraved the master plate. If you look along the left, it says that it's lithographed by Evans and Cogswell. So they were simply taking stones that were produced from this master plate that Keating and Ball made and printing the notes. They were not involved in the design. This is an even later printing where it's gone all the way to simply engraved and printed by Keating and Ball. So by this time, they were doing the whole show on some notes, not all. So this had an unhappy ending. They did not ride off into the sunset arm in arm. Keating and Ball had disagreements with the government over, surprise, payments, and terminated its business in February of 1865. That really didn't make much difference because they burned Columbia to the ground in the middle of the month. And that effectively terminated any further note production of any significance from anybody because all the printers had been located to Columbia. So that decision in May of 1862 to move everybody to Columbia was not a bad decision, but they would have been better off if they'd all stayed in Richmond. Now, only by another 4 or 5 weeks, but nonetheless, that's what happened. So J.T. Patterson, we mentioned, was an early early guy that took over a lot of the business from Hoyer and Ludwig. He was a doctor, personal friend of the vice president, didn't hurt. Now he had two facilities. He had a facility in Columbia, South Carolina that printed government notes, and he had another facility in Augusta, Georgia that printed Confederate stamps and other banknote customers. You'll see his imprint on a lot of Southern scrip and even commercial banknotes, a few from this era. So he had two different plants, perhaps at the behest of the Confederate government, simply because they didn't want to pay the overhead for printing somebody else's notes. And Patterson did no design work. All he was a printer. He printed whatever he had plates for. His contracts were terminated in 1863, and his employees were absorbed by a new entrant, Evans and Cogswell. Evans and Cogswell were both friends of Secretary Memminger and entered the business at his request. The firm moved to Columbia in January of 1863. They did not, like Patterson, they didn't do any design work, and they continued on to the end until Columbia fell on February 17, 1865. The smallest and the last printer is a little outfit called Archer and Daly and Archer and Halpin. It was formed in 1862 after Archer had a fallout with Keating. So Archer is a Keating and Ball alumni. And they printed primarily bonds and stamps, but they also they got one note. They got to print the 50-cent note for 1863 and early to 1864, by which time the note had virtually no practical use.
Those are steel plate.
Yes, they are.
They're embossed. If you look at them, they're really nice.
Nope. Halpin was another Keating and refugee that joined the firm in 1862, and the firm lost all of its contracts in September of 1864 due to delivery and quality issues. Other than that, they were doing a good job. So, the point of this is that this isn't the end. We've just barely scratched the surface. There are all sorts of stories to be told here, but it takes a lot of burrowing through correspondence, which thankfully there is a fair amount of that available, to understand what all these little situations were. The one with Keating and Ball is particularly interesting to figure out once and for all. So if there's something you would always be looking for to research, this is it. So, any questions?
So Wendell, there's one more story. It's a short one, but it's not proven. But this involves Hoyer and Ludwig, Keating, Ball, and the T-47 and T-48. Okay.
Yeah.
So the T-47 and T-48 are the fantasy notes that no one really knows where they came from. They've been called counterfeits. Ball called them Eastern Tennessee counterfeits. Other people thought they were essay notes or patterns. But when you really go dig into them, and Philip Chase is the researcher who did this. Philip Chase was a Confederate researcher of the mid-20th century. He was Ball's mentor, actually, or one of Dr. Ball's mentors. So these things are Hoyer and Ludwig design vignettes on these notes.
Mm-hmm.
They're on terrible, terrible paper. They are dated September 2, 1862, as well as the other Hoyer T-46 note. The one of them, the 47 looks like, or the 48 looks like the 46, actually. And that same time frame, around August, September of 1862, there was a counterfeit scare. We talked about that yesterday in a counterfeit presentation. There was a counterfeit scare. Memminger, one of the things he looked at, investigated, was printed signatures. And he asked for patterns of printed signatures, none of which were found. Those would have been essay notes if they were submitted, and there would have been only a small, very small sample created. T-47 and 48 don't quite fit that pattern, but they kind of fit that pattern. They are printed signatures. They're the only Confederate notes besides the 50 cents that were printed signatures, and they were done around. They're dated and were done with vignettes from Hoyer and Ludwig right around the time Hoyer and Ludwig was losing business, and when Memminger was looking for these printed signature samples. But there's a couple of problems with those being considered patterns or essays. Number one, there's a whole bunch of them. There's 70 or 80 of the 47, and there's about 30 or 40 of the 48s, and they probably only had about a 1% survival rate given the quality of the paper. they wouldn't have printed that many as samples. Number two, the workmanship, both the quality of the paper and the workmanship was so terrible, would you have ever, no one would ever submit something like that to get a job. It would be like, you know, turning in a crayon scribble on an interview and hoping you could get an artist job or something. The last thing is that these are Hoare and Ludwig design vignettes and stuff, but Keating and Ball's name is on the note misspelled. Columbia, South Carolina is spelled Columbus, South Carolina. So there's all these things on here that are wrong. Philip Chase's theory was, in a fit of also revenge and trying to discredit Keating and Ball, Hoare and Ludwig created these and spread these around Richmond in the printed signature request to make it look like Keating and Ball was going to do some terrible work. Yes. And so that's a theory that's not proven. It's Philip Chase's theory, and it's actually, out of all the theories I've heard about those notes, the most plausible in my mind.
Was Leggett a Union agent or not? Was there any?
No, because he was still around after that. They didn't hang him or shoot him or extradite him. He was, in fact, he was involved with some of the other printers, suggesting that Keating and Ball were the people who were actually the traitors to the cause. So it's like, yeah.
Keating himself was a British subject, was he not?
I don't remember if Leggett was or was
well,
not.
Now, this is Keating.
Keating was, yes.
Yeah.
So two of them were actual engravers, and Leggett was the odd man out. And I haven't found anything that they, like I said, they just accused him of being a friend, and Memlinger's position was, how can you have a guy like this involved with all the intimate, deep, dark secrets of printing money for the government if he's in fact maybe passing this along to his old buddy? So that was the reason they forced him out, but I think he remained in the South. Anything else? Going once, going twice. Thank you very much.